Now you're welcome along to a very special Wednesday Night Rugby. As usual, Keith Wood is alongside me. Good evening, Keith. Hello.
Good evening. How are you, Joe?
Very well, very well. I am happy to say we have a special guest for this evening. He played just the 139 times for Australia between 94 and 07. He is a World Cup winner. He is legendary in his field. George Gregan, all the way from Australia. Good evening to you. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for having me on the show. Looking forward to it.
So, Keith, would you open the contacts book and drag this fella along, I suppose, for the evening? That's the plan.
Well, I did. I mean, I know George forever. I think at this stage we both started around the same time, back in the early '90s. But I think latterly, since we've retired, we've become part of a alternative whiskey club where every time we meet, it's the whiskey club is now open. So it's it's one of those kind of lovely things that you get to know guys that you play against. You don't like them, you do like them, you kick that out of each other, but when you stop playing, you get a chance to have a chat. And we meet up every time we can. So all the matches that happened in the autumn, but World Cup Tokyo, we'd a haul in Tokyo for the World Cup. It was fantastic. So it's great to have him back out on air.
George, where in Australia are you at the moment?
In Sydney. I've been living in Sydney since 96. Grew up in Canberra, went to school, university. My parents still live there, but been in Sydney since 96. So Sydney's home for me at the moment. And I guess we'll get into it. But it's going into Easter. Good time of year wise in April in Sydney, but it's totally different to what we're seeing. I guess that's everywhere around the world due to what we're dealing with, the pandemic, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, everywhere around the world is struggling, to say the least. But Australia, when you throw in the fires on top of everything, has been through the ringer in a big way. What a year.
Yeah, it has been. It's been an incredible 12 months, but particularly through the summer period. It went from just incredible droughts. I remember we spoke, Woody mentioned it earlier, we obviously caught up during Rugby World Cup. I remember doing an event with some of the Aussie farmers, and they were talking about, normally they're really positive farmers, they expect the rain, the drought will break. But they were 3.5 years into it, and it was like, we just don't know when it's going to end. And then on top of that, we had the bushfires, and then we had these ridiculous rains afterwards as well, which caused flooding. So it went from one extreme. One week, they were shutting down towns and getting people to evacuate because of the chance of fire, and then they go back into their homes because they've beaten that natural disaster and they get flooded. So it was a really crazy time. And then obviously you roll into what the world's dealing with now, but it's been an incredible 12 months. Where we live in Sydney, sometimes the visibility of all the places, Canberra, where I grew up in, that was at times the world's worst quality air. It's normally the cleanest air in the world. So that gives you an example of just how much the fires are having an impact on this country.
So you said there drought for the last 3.5 years in the build-up to the fires. Yeah,
it has been. It's been bone dry. It's been, and that's obviously the worst mix. You go into a drought. There's obviously a 3.5 year drought. There's a lot of fuel, which is obviously the trees, the dry fuel, the dry shrubbery, and then you add extreme heat, which we had. It was just unprecedented how hot the summers were, and then it just takes a few which occurred. Some of them were man-made, which is really disappointing. Were caused by people, but it's a terrible mix of lots of fuel. Lots of extreme heat, and then the big thing was the change of winds. Like even in Sydney, as I said, the visibility sometimes was you couldn't see past your face, so to speak. To be fair, and then a southerly would blow in and that would change the visibility, but it would actually change the direction of the fire. So there was no let up in the fire. There may have been let up in the visibility and the air quality, but there was no let up in the fires because of this change of wind direction, which was just causing havoc for all the fire people around our country who were just amazing what they did. It was just a relentless summer for Australia.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah, I presume that has prompted a hell of a discussion around climate change. I mean, you down there, you guys seem to be at the front line of it.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely caused a lot of discussion and it causes a lot of heated debate, but the reality around the world is something's happened. You just look at for what we've just experienced over this summer period and the build up to it and the impact it's having in other parts of the world. I went to Zambia years ago with the family in 2012 and did a few things in Livingston Rugby Club. we set up a little foundation there. Well, not a foundation, a club, literally a rugby club. You like this footy. Hopefully get you there to do a week's coaching with the kids. You just teach them how to play rugby, tag rugby. They all play football. You teach them to play rugby, so it's quite an unusual thing to do. You get them to throw the ball backwards to run forwards. You do that instinctively when you learn the game of rugby, but if you're coaching it to kids who've never done it before, it's quite an interesting phenomenon. But they pick it up really quick because it's games and it's fun. But cutting to like why I bring Livingston and Zambia up is it's Victoria Falls. Like it's always, even in the dry season, there's water going over. It was bone dry. Like there's no water on the Zambezi River flowing over Victoria Falls, and that gives you a real big, visual example of how the impact of, I reckon, global warming is having. If there's no water in Victoria Falls, that's quite incredible.
Yeah. Keith, you've often been on the show down the years and talked about the admiration you have for Australian rugby played at its best. So talk to us about where George Gregan fits into all that.
Yeah, he doesn't fit into it at all. What I loved with so I got my first test against Australia in '94. I think George got his first test a few weeks either before or after. I can't remember.
Yeah, that's it. '94. Exactly.
And it wasn't just. They didn't have a huge number of players because everybody would always go for the comparison and say, well, obviously you need to follow the All Blacks because they have got such an inherent sense of skill and they've got this conveyor belt of players that are coming through. Australia and rugby, and we'll talk about how rugby is struggling in Australia, and it is really struggling at the moment, but it's fourth or fifth sport, very similar to rugby in Ireland. So that's where the similarities are. Some of the great athletes go and play in other sports, for rugby in particular, Gaelic football. Some of the guys, you just love to take some of the greats from Gaelic football and to manoeuvre them over into a rugby backline. But it's the use they make of their players. They have a player who's a really good player. Even if he isn't in the right position, it doesn't seem to matter to Australia. They'll always get the best players onto the field. And I always liked that. There was an interchangeability about it. Now, not with George as a nine. And George was a world-class nine from pretty much the first days he started playing. But all the other players moved across the back line. So you players played at 10 or 15 or 12, or Matt Gitto played at 9, 10 and 12. And, so suddenly you had this ability to make certain that you had players who were leaders, who could understand the game incredibly well, really good footballers, would be able to pull the rabbit out of a hat because they got all their class players on the field. So if they had two guys, so I often thought about it, the Tony Ward and Ollie Campbell conversation that used to happen over out halves in the late 70s in Ireland, they would never have been fighting with each other. They would always have been on the same team in Australia because they didn't want to have made certain to get the good guys on the field. And I just thought, because the amount of players that Australia had, that they were the ones that we should follow. They were smart. They played smart rugby a lot of the time. And I think partly as well to do with the Australian Institute of Sport back in that particular period of time, they were ahead of the game in an awful lot of physiological sides, and we weren't. And I thought for us, they were the ones to go and look at it. But look, I grew up, and I was fortunate to play against some of them. I grew up watching Lina and Campese, and they were just phenomenal players. Then played against them at the end of their career. But there never seemed to be a big fall off in Australia in that period of time. So they had a great team. And as soon as that great team were gone, you'd Georgie, you'd Larkham, you had Timmy Horn and Little, and there was just so many players of huge quality that just consistently came through and stayed for 10 years. They rarely had players that came and played really well for a year or 2 years. They kept them for 10 years. They seemed to get the best and exact the most out of all their top players.
George, we know the career you went on to have, and you burst on the scene with the Jeff Wilson tackle in '94. I think that was your fourth test.
Yeah, it was.
Were you hot stuff as a youngster coming through when you were 17, 18, 19? Were you earmarked to go on to great things?
I would like to be saying no. Honestly, I think I was one of those guys. I was always small, so that never changed throughout my whole life. But from about under 16s, so under 16s, you got your rep teams under under 10s through to that age bracket. I think it's everywhere. And from about under 15s, I struggled to make starting rep teams. I'd make the squad, but I wasn't the starting halfback. I started playing halfback from about under 14s, but up until then I was a fly half, so I was playing number 10. And so I enjoyed it, but I was probably, to be fair, at that stage of my life, I was really focused on cricket. I just love cricket. I actually had a podcast the other day with a guy called Shane Lee, who played Australia in Test cricket, but also one days. He won a World Cup in '99. And his brother's Brett Lee, who was a wonderful fast bowler for our country, and I used to play against him at that age. That's under 16s through to under 19s. And my big focus was cricket. I wanted to sort of try and, become an Australian cricketer and play with the likes of Ricky Ponting and the Adam Gilchrist. But when I played against them, I realised I was never going to be that calibre. They were so good. But I played rugby as well because it was a winter sport. And then I always thought, well, maybe I wasn't big enough, or maybe I wasn't. Maybe I just didn't get the opportunity that I would have liked. But I still loved the game of rugby. And then when I left school, I went to my local club, and then you're playing a bit of Colts, which was under 19s, under 20s at that stage. We had a good year, had a fun year. Like, we had a good time off the field, and we ended up winning the competition. So it was kind of nice. And then before you know it, you sort of get I got offered a scholarship, not for cricket, but for rugby union when I was about 18 or 19. And that's probably when I started thinking, hang on, I should take this seriously, because not many people are getting scholarships, particularly out of Canberra. And I got a chance living in Canberra. The Australian Institute of Sport was in Canberra, so I got the best access to all those facilities, the best coaching. I really applied myself, which is what I had to do to give it a crack, because that's probably what I was trying to do with cricket. But it ended up being rugby, which I love. I always loved rugby, but someone saw something in me, and before you know it, you get an opportunity. You're playing sevens in 93, 94. I'm making Australian sevens teams. I go to Hong Kong in 94. Bob Dwyer sees something in me at the Hong Kong sevens, but Glenelg was my coach, and Glenelg was the backs coach for the Wallabies in that period. So someone takes a punt on a youngster. I think we've all had it. It would have been the same with Woody. He may have been a star from the time he was probably 12, I reckon. but I definitely was more focused on cricket at that stage in my career. It's quite funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
Funny, I'm just laughing. I started scrum half and out half, and it's where I played until I was 16, and didn't play a huge amount in school. Actually, I stopped because I was so small, and only started back again at 16 or 17. And when all those representative things kind of go to happen in school, we had Munster schools trials and Ireland schools trials when I was 16, 17, but I was playing hurling for Clare instead. And that was the end of my hurling, as it turned out. And I only really started, and I loved rugby in school, and I loved it in the last year of school. But it's when you start afterwards. So I joined again Colts, under 19s, under 20s, playing for Gary Owen, and my first coach was Paddy Reid, who had won the Grand Slam in 1948 with a 40-year ban for playing rugby union. He was my first coach. And it is about finding somebody who says he's got something a little bit different. Let's pick him. Let's give him a start and see what happens.
Yeah, that's it.
George, if we draw a line to start with from, say, 94 through to 99, you come on the scene, the Jeff Wilson tackle is a nice way to announce yourself. You get the 95 World Cup thrown in there, which is historic and iconic and memorable for all sorts of reasons. And then you go and win the World Cup in 99 under Rod McQueen. You must be thinking to yourself, this is pretty sweet, isn't it? Is it always going to be like this? This is amazing stuff. That's kind of a magical introduction to national rugby.
It was a magical start, to be fair. I was on the bench for 2 games against Ireland in 94 when Woody played. And then I got my start playing against Italy. And then we played Samoa after we played Ireland. And then obviously my 4th test was the All Blacks. And then the next time, that the following year, it's World Cup in South Africa. We're playing the first game against the hosts, and they end up becoming the world champions. But we lose that game. We went in as very strong favourites because the team had won in 1991. So I was part of a wonderful team. You mentioned some of the names: Tim Horans, Jason Littles, Rob McQueen, Rob McCalls. You had Ewan McKenzie. Gosh, you had Campo. It was such an amazing team who'd won in 91. And there was still a core of those guys in that squad. And there's some young players coming through, like the Matt Burks. There was like Scott Bowen, myself, Daniel Herbert, Joe Ross, But we failed in that World Cup. So we went from hero to zero very quickly. You learn that really quickly. You learn that in sport. But I hadn't lost a test until that first game in Cape Town. So I think I played 6 test matches with the Wallabies or whatever, and we'd won every single test match. So that was my first loss, and it was a terrible feeling, but that was the reality of my start. It was probably too good a start. Like, sport brings you back to reality really quickly. And then between 95 and 99, it sounds like everything tracked really well. We got our bums kicked a heap of times, that Wallaby team. I remember the All Blacks were like a little toy doll for them as a cat, like a kitten playing with a toy doll or something. That's what we were from about 96, 97. We were on and off against the Springboks. We could beat them at home, but we couldn't beat them away. And we were very inconsistent. And then Rob McQueen came in at the end of 1997. We went on a tour to Argentina. I think we'd lost a test match there for the first time since 1970-something, and we were the worst Wallaby team ever since then. And to think from that moment to 99, November, we become world champions. It does, if you look at it, just looking at the stats, it looks as though it was a pretty smooth ride. We actually went through some hard times. I remember being on the end of like a 40-point hiding against the Springboks in Pretoria, and that was in 1997. So no, there was a lot of learnings. There's a lot of dark moments for that team, but we came through. The strength of that squad was we were quick learners, and we cared for each other, and we worked hard. Good coaching from Rob McQueen and coaches around, but really drove the leaders to drive the team, and Woody knows all about that. He's been part of some very successful teams, and that's really, really important. And then a crux of that team stayed together post that 99 campaign. So we'd had some some bad times, but you have to do that to enjoy the good times. Otherwise, it's not as enjoyable, it's not as rewarding. But that was reality. Yeah.
I've seen you talk about what McQueen brought to the setup or the secret to that World Cup win, the win against France in the final ultimately, and you used the phrase consistency of thought. You might explain what that means in that Australian context.
Yeah, we spoke about that a lot. I think, it would be interesting to hear Woody, because he was part of, I thought that Lions team in 2001, I watched them in 1997. They definitely were another great team, which inspired us as well in terms of being able to take your game away from home. I think if you want to be a great team, you can be a good team, but if you want to be a great team, you've got to be able to take your game away from where you're comfortable, and more often than not, you're comfortable in your own backyard. So if you can win away from where you're comfortable, then you're well and truly on the path to being a very, very good team, potentially a great team. And you have to be consistent, and that consistency of thought, I think, provides consistency of action, consistency of your habit. Does it guarantee success? No, it doesn't. But I tell you what, you're going to be in the wrestle more often than not. And that was, I think, what that team was. We won a lot of test matches in that period by very narrow margins. It wasn't necessarily because we were more highly skilled or better prepared or whatever it was, but we were very consistent in terms of how we trained and were prepared for those moments, and we look forward to them. I think that's another thing. I want to hear that from Woody too, because I think you look forward to those pressure moments, because that's what it's all about. And that was definitely the hallmark of the success of that team, was very consistent in how we went about those moments and how we prepared for them.
I found playing against that particular Australia team, 98, 99, 2000, 2001, I played a few tests and lost all of them, apart from the first Lions test in 2001. I've never felt as much pressure in a game as I did in those games, because I felt I'm not saying that you knew everything that we knew, but you seem to be a step ahead an awful lot of the time. From in the forwards perspective, you didn't have a good scrummaging pack. I mean, you were a poor scrummaging pack, but you were magnificent cheaters in the scrum. Your ability to drop a scrum and tie your shoelaces is kind of like a throwback to
clean the boots.
It was but it was amazing, because you'd get hammered in the scrum, and then for some very strange reason, you'd get totally on the top in one or two scrums in the whole game. It was as if you knew you could only focus on a couple. But in the lineouts for me, I found it was horrendous, with Ealesy in the second row, and a lot of the time not being lifted at all. He would jump on his own. So you'd lift the other two guys at the front and the back, and you're like threading a needle to try and find your window. Psychologically, for me, that was where I was always at my most vulnerable, was against Australia, in trying to trying to thread that needle. And I always felt you were so entirely. I thought you were really well coached in that period of time. But I thought as a group of players, you seemed to be incredibly focused all the time. So you played it so simplistically, so well all the time. And you call it down as that consistency. I just didn't think he made an awful lot of mistakes at the stage. Like, I give an example. I lost 3 lineouts, I think it was, in the World Cup in '99 against Australia. I could have lost 12. I mean, you were an inch away from nearly every single ball in the lineout, and all I was thinking when I was going up to the lineout was, this is not where I want to be. You know, if I could have been anywhere else, I just felt that the amount of pressure you were putting as a team on different players in different situations was pretty extraordinary. And even when you played badly, I felt you were always in a position to win a match. You stayed in the games until the last 10 minutes, and you had the ability then of players to do something magic. But I looked at that Lions tour in 2001 a couple of weeks ago. Joe Roth was magnificent. I mean, absolutely stunning. Larkham just coasted around the field he really struggled in the first test. He was really poor in the first test, and then in the latter 2 tests, he just did whatever he felt like doing.
Yeah. But you know what's funny about looking at that too, Woody, was just the speed. Like I know the modern game's fast, and you can never compare it. But I've seen that series, and it was played at an incredible speed and intensity, and just the skill. It was quite an amazing. Like you look back on it, because I think it's interesting when you're in the moment, because there's 3 big test matches over consecutive weeks. You got to have a short-term memory, because you got to dust that off and move on. But over time, you look back on it and you go, wow, that was some series. Like, and it's just moments. It's little moments. Like, I think we were on our knees in that second test, just before half time. I think you guys were nearly about to score, and then it just, the ebb and flow of that series and the players, it was amazing. You know, we get to catch up over the World Cups. You see those guys, and obviously we get on right now, but they were epic battles, and just played at an incredible intensity and a really high skill level, I thought. It was a pleasure to be part of that series. And as a player, like, you guys get to, if you're good enough, you get to play on it. Maybe you get to play a couple of times for the Lions, or a couple of tours if you're good enough, which you definitely were the case. But for us, it's a once in a career. I talk about Nathan Sharp. Nathan Sharp played over 100 test matches for Australia, but his first test for the Wallabies was 2002. I think his last one was 2012. So he missed the window. He missed his 12-year window by a year on either side. And that's the nature of, that's how special a Lions series was for me, because you don't get to play the Lions. You're lucky to play them in your career, let alone a series like that, which was just epic.
Yeah, it was magic. It was quick. I looked at it the other weekend. I've never watched the games fully through, so I looked at it. I couldn't get over the scrums. They happened instantaneously.
Yeah.
They were an unbelievable wrestle and hard, but there was no messing around. There was a bit of a smash into it, which we know is dangerous, and that's gone. But I think they could tidy up the scrums an awful lot more. They should be an awful lot faster. Yeah,
and the ball was like, there's this contest, but when the ball was ready to move, we just moved it, didn't we? Both teams, and it was game on. And that was the mindset of both teams. It was pretty special.
Keith, from memory, was there needle between the 2 teams in that 0-1 series?
Yes. Not a personal needle, really. There was a little bit between Matt Dawson and the plank.
that came from Healy, didn't it? It was Dawson, Healy. Yeah, Healy. It was more Healy. Yeah.
But so we had a bit of needle. It was for us. It was a strange tour. So when we went in '97, we were mostly kids. A few guys had toured before, but not a huge amount. Total underdogs. Kind of going to be the end of the lines, and we win a series in South Africa, and that's pretty fantastic, and like just so far up there on highlight reel, you know, it's brilliant. But then 4 years later we go, and I felt a lot of the guys who had been in '97 almost took it for granted that they were there by right, and you just can't do that. You have to prove it every second of every training session and then of every match, and we ended up with a sort of a bit of a them and us and dirt trackers part of it. And so there was some of the bitching that was there. There was a bit of edge. There was also that disgraceful McRae incident on Rog, where he pummeled Rog into the ground, which was a disgrace. So there was a bit of edge from that, and there was a bit of edge in the match because we wanted to win.
Sure.
But not an edge. Do you know the way you can say, well, I don't like those guys? That wasn't the attitude. There was a huge amount of respect on that tour. I mean, between two teams, incredible respect from it. And we kicked the crap out of each other for three tests. I mean, it was at 1,000,000 miles an hour. But I can tell you that 5 minutes after the final, I was having a beer with Foley, with Michael Foley. He took some beers, came in and sat down, and we sat down, we had a chat and a beer, because that's what you're supposed to do after it. And it was the lowest I ever felt, losing that series, because we really wanted to win the series. We had a very good team. He had a very good team. We were falling apart by the end, and there's no excuses on any of that. But we were literally held together with string at it. We needed to win the second test because we didn't know whether we had it, and I thought we pulled a huge amount of stops out in the third test. But that wiped the floor with all of us. So I was as low as I could possibly be, I'd say, after that. It was amazing. And actually, when you look back at it, and it's funny, as you get older, the sports fans hate this as a thought, but as you get older, you look and you say, well, you win some and you lose some.
That's it.
And there's two teams involved in them, so it's plus or minus depending on who you are. And I think if you look back and say that was something that was fantastic, and if you remember how difficult it was, and it was difficult, we were struggling to put players on the field. I still think it's the funniest thing of all time that the sub scrum half in that last test had been on a beer up tour for 3 weeks before.
That's Andy Nichol, wasn't it?
Andy Nichol. And the only reason that he actually was on the bench was because they had to breathalyze him to climb the Sydney Harbour Bridge the day before. And that's what we were down to, and it's a very tough thing, but I watch it with my sons. That's something now that makes it really nice. I watch it with my sons. They loved the standard of rugby, that there was offloads coming from everywhere, and it was going 1,000,000 miles an hour. And it's kind of nice to look back on it. I still wish we bloody won it, though.
Yeah, of course. But it's funny you talk about that moment, like post game, you're having a few beers with Foles. Like I remember going out of that change room because of this press and everything. We left our change room opposite the Lions, and Jono came out at the same time. He's gutted. We've all been there. Those big moments, you want to win them. It's like it's a final. It was a final. And then we go up, we have a beer together, like we always did, no different at Twickenham or when we played England here in Australia. And we got over it after having a few beers. And then, the next time I saw John, I obviously saw him a few times in between in Twickenham and in Australia, leading into the 2003 World Cup. You get to the 2003 World Cup final, our next biggest sort of deja vu, 2 years later. We leave at the same time. It's kind of funny. And I said, I guess we're not having an after-match function. It was after the final. I said, I guess we would have had a beer together, mate. I guess it's a flip side this time around, mate. I'm feeling how you did 2 years ago. So that well done being a world champ type thing. That's how it is. People kind of sometimes don't want to hear those stories, but that's the reality of it. There's a huge amount of respect between two teams, particularly when you get to those moments. They're the highlight of your career. Everything's on the line, but it's a game of rugby, and we're lucky enough to be inside the arena. You never lose sight of that, and you certainly respect the players you're up against, because you're not a mug if you're running out on the field and you're playing against each other. And there's always that deep respect. But as Woody says, and no different to me, you want to win those games. They're the ones. But sport's the way it doesn't allow you always to win. So that's how you deal with it. And I think rugby's great for that. It's a great sport for that.
George, you mentioned 03 there. So Eddie Jones is obviously still a very relevant figure in our lives today, and still, making headlines for all sorts of reasons. Tell us about the Jones that you worked under for that 03 World Cup. Was he impressive as a coach? What was his manner? How did he deal with you? Give us a sense of him.
He's impressive, and he's always going to say things which I think they're just the wrong moment. And he's done that a few times throughout his career. I know he's done that in the lead up to Six Nations games. But if you got to knowing the man, he just really cares for his players. He really cares for his team, and he wants to be the best prepared coach in the world. He wants to learn from the best coach in the world. It could be Bill Belichick, it could be Mourinho, it could be who am I thinking of? Who's at Manchester? Who was from
Alec.
Alec Ferguson. But then even now he was at he's Spanish.
Guardiola.
He's got the beard and everything. Yeah, Guardiola. I remember he did a Guardiola. Went to a session with him when he was coaching at Munich. He said, I thought I was going, well, this is 2015. He says, but I'm still on training wheels as a coach. I went and saw a session, and what they did in 15 minutes just inspired me in terms of how I want to prepare my players and so on and so forth. So he's always looking at how to improve his program to create the best environment for his players to perform. So that was kind of his mindset. He's obviously a totally different coach. Like, he's much better now than he was then, but he was very, very good in 2003. But we prepared for that World Cup campaign very much like, for us, that's like when the World Cup, remember we played Ireland, actually one of the great weekends, a bit of an aside story. So you had the international game, so the Gaelic AFL sort of hybrid game was played, I think, on the Friday night at the stadium we played, which was at that stage, I think it was the Colonial Stadium.
Telstra.
Yeah, the Telstra. And then we had that afternoon, the next day on the Saturday, they had Derby Day, which is on the last weekend of October. And then that night was our game. And they obviously didn't, they know Aussies drink, but they obviously didn't factor in how much the Irish drink. So Aussies and Ireland together in the same stadium. They ran out of beer before half time in that stadium. And they said it's been the biggest weekend ever in Melbourne, but particularly that stadium, they've never had sales like it. And, you know, we prepared that World Cup campaign very much like that race there. Derby Day is the one before Melbourne Cup. So we approached the World Cup like it was a spring carnival, like we wanted to be preparing. So our big day was hopefully Melbourne Cup. So he was really big on preparing and making sure that we did everything we could so we were going to be peaking at the right time. And, you know, the amount of training, the volume that we did in the lead up to it, we trained really hard like everyone does. Like everyone trains hard before a World Cup. And everyone's in probably their best nick of their career, but he was really, really deliberate, and that really had a big impact on us. So when we got to the year ends, like from Ireland onwards, they were the games we really targeted because they were knockout games for us. It was just making sure we were physically right, so he tapered. So he's very, very clever in that regard, and he has the ability to really push his players and push the best out of his coaches, but he, at the same time, he has that ability to share that vision of what we want to be looking like if we were to get to the big race, so to speak. And that's the hallmark of Eddie. He's one of the best prepared coaches I ever worked with. He's the best coach I worked under, but in terms of his preparation, he just never stops learning.
And George, where were you on the field when Johnny Wilkinson drops that ball? And
I was yelling, I've got his left foot, Georgie, come from the other angle. I was thinking he's on his left foot. You'll see me running. I see the film Kahuri friggin' World Cup in the lead up to it, don't I, Woody? I'm on the wrong side because the smart ass kicked it on his right boot. Smart ass, he was too good for everyone. No one saw that party trick. That was his special trick. He did it a few times later in his career, but no, he knocked it over on his opposite boot. But he's always set up for that, and that's where I was. So I was running. I was going, shit, he's kicking on his right. I can't get to his right. No, it's too good.
Would you have had his left covered?
Oh, I wouldn't have had it covered. If he set up for it, you would have been died. Would have made it more difficult, but you weren't even a factor because he just caught him. He was on his right boot, so you're in his periphery. You weren't even in his periphery.
Yeah.
He was dead to me. I was dead to him, so to speak. He was just knocking it over, which he did.
God, that's the genius in that moment of pressure, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. That is, and it sounds like that moment. And he would have practiced. You know what he's like with his practice. He would have been preparing for that moment, and that was just he was ready for it, and he knocked it over as such.
He didn't even know you were there, Georgie. That's
I know.
The only thing
that's it.
The ball, and he knew he was going to kick it, and it was going over the posts, and
that's it.
Everything he was oblivious to everything else around him. You know, Extraordinary guy, Johnny. Very interesting. There's a madness in the amount of work he's put into his game, and he's very interesting to try and get him when you get him in a quiet spot to have a chat about it and just to go through it. It is all those real greats, all those guys that have those huge moments and they've practiced so much. There is a madness to that brilliance too, you know.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, Kearnsey and I caught up with him in 2015 at the World Cup in England, And it was just good. Like, we got him in one of those quiet moments, and he was just so happy to see us, and just so happy to break bread and have a nice meal. And we didn't talk too much about rugby, just a bit of everything. Yeah, he's a quality guy, and you could just see you'd like him to be doing more of that, just catching up with, which I think is special about our sport.
Yeah.
George, we had Owen Redden on the show last week, who predominantly obviously played here in Ireland, but was over at Wasps as well for a period in his career, and is of the scrum half cohort. And he was, he's very interesting on a few things which you'd be able to maybe give your perspective on. So he was saying when he plays rugby in Ireland, there was just an expectation that he would just pass the ball, pass. That was what we seemed to want. Whereas if he did that at Wasps, he'd be in the dressing room at halftime and they'd be saying, "You haven't made one single break. You're offering no threat. Like, what are you doing?" And he also talked about how when he went onto the pitch, he primed himself in effect to just react to what was going on. He's the first point of contact with the ball. He has to take each game almost on its merits, the pace, the tempo, what's going on. And he talked about getting into that kind of calm mindset, as opposed to going out to impose himself on a game, which I thought was really interesting. He's another thoughtful character. So the two questions tied into one are the Wasps Ireland thing. What were the expectations on you as an Australian scrum half, and what was your mindset across those 139 tests?
Yeah, it changed, but it stayed the same in many ways. Like, I remember Bob Dwyer blowing up one stage early in my career, because like you got Michael Liner outside you as a halfback, you want to deliver to your 10 or your first receiver. That could be a running forward, it could be your fly half, it could be someone on the short side. Campese used to call for the ball a lot, so if he called it, he always wanted it. So you've got to have that ability to play it, but you also got to see what's around you. And if there's no one sort of what we call the pillar 10, 20, 30 defender around the ruck, if there's space there, you take it. I remember a few times I was passing because I was getting overcalled by, maybe it was Noddy on one side, I had Camp on the other side, and then they're not arguing, but they're demanding the ball, but there's an opportunity for me and I didn't take it. So Bob Dwyer at halftime gives me a bollocking, a bit like that Wasp. He says, "Where's the space? Blah, blah, blah." And take the space. That's a G-rated version of what he said to me. And so there's always that expectation that you need to run when the space is there and take it and follow your instinct. So I think as a 9, watching a Far Jones and a Peter Slattery, they were great halfbacks in Australian rugby. They had that ability to be really quick off the deck, but if there's a chance for them to run, they took that space with their legs. That's how I like to play. And then obviously, as the game evolved and teams got really good at defending, rugby league had a big impact. I remember that Lions team, that English team over that period, and also all the teams got really good at setting up their defence. And so if you were just passing as a halfback, those first 3 defenders didn't have any decisions to make. And a lot of the time, particularly under fatigue, those first 3 defenders are often tight forwards, or they're people who don't want to be having a halfback bouncing out, asking questions of them with running threats around them, so you can pick them off. So there's a real opportunity for you to ask questions around there. Then you start defending outside that. That was how we just worked really closely. Not giving secrets away, it's nothing new, but often outside those forwards you've got backs, and we used to call that a transition zone where the backs and the forwards are defending. And if you're asking questions of the forwards, then that transition zone becomes quite loose, and we really attack that pretty hard. And once they start tightening up through there, then that's when you release it. So it's just a simple of you're just mixing it around depending upon how the team and the speed of ball. So that was kind of it. I hope that's not too complicated. It's pretty simple. Like, wherever the space was, you took it. You'd either with your legs, and if someone's demanding it, like I had a saying and I always said that with even now when I coach a bit, like if the 10 or the blind winger or the fullback on the other side of the ruck is demanding the ball, they get it. It comes off the deck. And if you don't give it off the deck and they give you a bollocking, then you cop it. It's time to leave it off the deck. But if you see the space and you feel the space and you know it's there in terms of around the edge of the ruck, and they don't react off you and they're not hitting holes around the transition zone, then you give them a kick up the butt. So it sort of works. It works that way. So that was kind of how I always played. I always talk about you got to have as a 9. So a 9-10, you've obviously got your fullbacks and your back 3 and your centres. They're ball players, but particularly at the source around the ruck, there's ball playing opportunity for a 9. There's always ball playing 1 or 2 passes out. But if there's a ball playing opportunity and you operate off the 9, then you've got to react off the 9. Then everyone just plays off him. And it's simply, so then you've pretty much got 80% of the field covered when you attack. That's nothing. There's no rocket science to it, but that's a good attack. And you see that with good teams There's a threat around the 9. There's always a threat around, I see him in the background there. Johnny Sextons, your 10s, your 12s. You got a good fullback, blind winger who can be on the other side of the ruck. There's threats everywhere, and then you add in running forwards. It becomes tough to defend. Even if you go to the video, if you get a good quick ball and you've got the ability to play across those sort of pivots, it's hard to defend.
Were you generally a confident type? Because everything you're talking about there, I can imagine if you're on your game and feeling good about yourself and life and walking onto the pitch with an air of authority, I would say you're making those decisions instinctively, quick as you like. If you're not in the best frame of mind, that could all get a little bit overwhelming.
Yeah, it can. It's like anything, I reckon. You ask a golfer, look at Rory McIlroy, how well he hits the ball. There's sometimes he doesn't know where his driver's going. Not too many times when I watch him, but you get comfortable and you want to get to that place as much as you can. You want to be able to correct it, fix it. So for me, my bread and butter, it'd be interesting what Woody has to say, because I've been talking for too much now. But as a half, your bread and butter is your passing. So you want to get back to that. So if you're dropping your confidence, just get the ball out of your hands, hit your target, get that, then all of a sudden you're away. The skill set for the back line starts with you, really does. That's a big responsibility for a 9. So get that bread and butter right. Then all of a sudden you find your rhythm. Then all of a sudden, okay, my bread and butter's pretty good. We're away. There's a flow, the speed of ball. Then all the other things. Then your instincts start taking over. So I think that's always good. Always pass that on to young people when at a young age, and even when I'm coaching at a high level, I'll just say just trust your instincts. Get back to your basics. And that was no different for me. You're not always going to play perfect. You're going to make some mistakes. I threw plenty of bad passes. I'm sure Steve Larkin, I know he coaches down, so he can clarify a lot of those. But you just got to get back on the horse, and then you find your rhythm.
Yeah, I think there's different players and different times too. I think there's a lot less space now in the manner of which the defences are set up. There is very little space that you can take when you're picking the ball up from a ruck now at 9. I think that's kind of cut down a lot. It was funny, you play with Peter Stringer and we talk about Irish scrum halves passing. Well, Peter Stringer running into contact wasn't of much value, and so he didn't do it. And he gave a great line to me once. He said, Woody, once you call for the ball, the decision is made for me. I don't have to think about it. If you make a mess of it, that's your fault. I've given you the ball, you've called for it, you get it. And that's it. And you want him to trust the fact that if you make the call, you get the ball. And that's where I get annoyed with people who call all the time. They're always talking, and you see it when you talk to kids, and you see kids doing it. You see a winger who's 50 yards away for the ball, calling for the ball.
It's true.
It's not going to happen. It doesn't. All you're doing is annoying everybody inside you. And so it's about trying to make the right call at the right time, and you want that link between 9 and 10 all the time that works. But equally well, we tend to fight for the ball and go and play it. And Conor Murray's been coming under a bit of grief for this. The manner in which you played 9 was you'd pick the ball up at pace. You were very, very fast around it, but you would run laterally a lot to find the space, to find a gap, to find a hole for somebody to run into. And you were quite willing to take it into contact yourself then if you didn't. Not that you wanted to do it, but, and we tend not to do that so much at 9s in Ireland. We don't tend to be, we give out, he'd get a bollocking. Oh, look, he's running across the field. Well, actually, if somebody else makes the gap and he doesn't, that's the right thing to do. So look, I love listening to to playmakers, what they were doing, what their thought process was, and for me the view always was, and I wasn't a playmaker, but the view for me was I wanted to make life easier. So you kind of take a picture of the defence before you call for the ball, so you actually know where everybody is in a general sense, and then you know where you're almost instinctively running into a gap as to where it is. Because you want it a bit easier. That's you don't want to be smashed up all the time.
Yeah, and off the back of that too, Woody, is you're spot on. There's people in you who just call for the sake of calling, like that young winger who's calling it from 50, and you're saying you call it. When you call it, like you need it because you're in a better position than me, and so there becomes that understanding with players. And like a lot of my running forwards are much like you, Woody, never played with you, but would have been one of those ones where you're calling for it because you're calling for it. You're in space, so you get the ball. So that just comes with combination and playing a lot. But it sounds really simple, doesn't it? But it's really important to pass on to young people that ability. Call for it when you're in a better position than the person who's got the ball. Otherwise, you're just making noise, and you're annoying the players around you.
A quick last question or two, because we've kept you for long enough. What kind of captain were you? You became captain in 01. What would your teammates say about Gregan, the captain, if we asked them, do you suspect?
Well, I was hard in terms of, I was hard and fair, but I also was, I think I was caring. I was really, it's a good one to ask players actually, but I demanded a lot of myself, so I demanded a lot of the team. We set a high standard of how we trained, played, and just how we went about things. So I was big on that, but I was also big on, and I learnt this when I first got into the Wallaby team, switch on, switch off. So when we switch on, like be locked in, be ready to go, be it training, be it whatever it was that we need to do as a team. But when it's time to switch off, like enjoy each other's company, get to know each other. We're really big on, getting out of the hotel when we're on tour and doing things. Like we had plenty of great times where we went to Ireland as a group, and made sure that, okay, we did that, because you can't be thinking of the game all of the time. It just burns you out and you don't enjoy the experiences of what is great about our game. So I'd like to think that, but you should ask some of the guys who are under me. They might tell you a different story, but yeah, that's how I'd like to think I was the captain.
Yeah. Keith, what would they say about you? I've never asked you that before. Not what would you say about yourself? What would they say about you?
I'd say a bit of a ball breaker, to be honest. It's funny, you look back in it, and there was different times when I was captain as to do different things. I did far too much when I was a young captain. Tried to do everything, made of balls, but that happens, and you learn from that too. I was lucky enough to get another go at the end of my career, but it's we used to have a different coach every year, so you needed to have a bit of additional discipline or control, which I have to say is kind of part of me and isn't part of me in equal measures. So I think when you have more players around you that are senior and have more experience, captaincy becomes an awful lot easier, because
it's true.
When you're trying to be captain just yourself, and this is what you do what I say, and everybody does it that way, you're doomed to failure. It needs to be collaborative. You need to trust the players around you. You need to have good leaders at the core positions. 8, 9, 10 need to be able to think their way around the field. 15, if you're lucky, gives a great view on what's happening on a field. And if you're lucky enough to have characters in those positions, you tend to have a really good team with it. But look, as all captains, I would have done some really good things, a lot of bad things, made loads of mistakes. It's interesting. Captaincy is an interesting concept. I think it's one of those things that is often overrated and often underestimated in almost equal measure.
Yeah, it's true. Well said.
George, on Australian rugby, Keith mentioned we wanted to ask you about this. So we hear bad things and read bad things, and that applies to participation rates, that applies to the numbers watching games in stadiums, and it certainly applies to the financial situation. And that predates the COVID crisis, which I suspect will exacerbate all of that. So the interesting question almost is why has the game struggled in all these areas so acutely over the last decade or 15 years? What's happened?
Yeah, the thing is, like, it's a competitive landscape, but it's always been a competitive landscape. As Keith said at the beginning of the show, we're probably number 4 as a code in our country, but that hasn't changed. Internationally, one of the strongest. Like the cricketers, the Australian cricket team is probably number 1 in terms of international exposure. I think the Wallabies, maybe not so much, maybe after the World Cup, even though it was a poor performance, there was still drew a lot of the country behind the Wallaby team. And our soccer team, the Socceroos, get a lot of support as well, particularly if they qualify for a World Cup. It would be probably a cricket, rugby. But the domestic competition, which is our club competition, that's grown over the last 4 or 5 years. So there's a real tribal feel to that, particularly in New South Wales and Queensland. So there's rugby supporters there. They're getting 10 to 15,000 turning up to those games. So rugby's strong at that grassroots level, and there is participation. Has it dropped off a little bit? Yes, it has, but it has with like AFL, football, and rugby league as well. Same with the viewing, people turning up live, because there's been a big focus for those sports, and a big part of their income is the broadcasting rights, which Australian rugby doesn't have beyond this year. They're in negotiation. It's a tough time, and it's almost, if something's not done, it's almost going to a point where we've heard commentary around it, where they might be able to afford to be paying the players in maybe 5 to 6 months. Just that's the state of the financial sort of predicament, which is really sad. It almost sends rugby into a semi-amateur period, and to the point where they might need to be bailed out by the government, which has happened. Although I just saw today rugby league, so NRL in our country, they went to some UK banks to get some loans to help them get through this crisis, and then they'll repay them on future earnings once the game comes back online, and they can do that through their television and broadcasting deals. So it's a tough time for all codes in our country, but rugby has been struggling pre-COVID because of it. And answering your question around what's caused it, there's definitely been inconsistency in how the Wallabies have performed. There's been inconsistency in how our Super Rugby teams have performed. And there hasn't been consistency, I think, in how the game's been administered and how we want to play in our country. I think that's really critical. These all sound pretty simple solutions, but part of it is the communication and making everyone who's rugby, who loves the game of rugby in our country, feeling part of it. Doesn't matter if it's club rugby, grassroots, that filters into the next level, which might be Super Rugby. And that Super Rugby competition needs to mean something for people, which currently it doesn't, because their teams often go away for 4 weeks. You never see them. And people then, when they come back, they don't know what's going on in the competition. That needs to be revisited. And then there's consistency in how the national team performs, because I think it'd be no different in any country. If your national team's performing well, particularly here in Australia, it does bring people together. So yeah, that's the state of affairs. I'd like to be more upbeat. I'm always pretty positive about it, but it has been tough. It's been a tough one to swallow over this last 18 to 24 months, especially.
Right. Keith, any final questions or points you want to make to Mr. Gregan before we let him go?
No, I want a little insight into Stephen Larkham. Now that he's down in Munster. What are we going to see and expect from him?
Yeah, he's a very intelligent man, a very intelligent coach too. It's funny, he was one of those players who played with so much flair and he just looked as though he was playing, the whole saying, playing what's in front of him. He played with freedom, but we played a simple way, but we had a lot of structure around how we played too, which allowed people like him and Ross and others and the Horans to play with freedom. So he'll be looking to try and coach that way. And I think, which will be a really good evolution for him, is understanding the conditions that you play in the UK, and that varies depending upon its winter, firmer pitches, being able to adapt. I think that'll be the best evolution for Stevie in terms of his coaching, because he does like his structure. He knows what he wants to be doing in different parts of the field. Very clever when it comes to first phase plays, be it from scrums and lineouts, and understanding how he wants to move his team around. But I think that ability to adjust your game, not just on a week-to-week basis, but also within a game, is something which he'll benefit from being in Munster. And I think that's his big learning. But he wants to learn. He's a very competitive man. Don't be fooled by his demeanour. He's super competitive. But he loves the game of rugby, and I know he's loving it. No, he and his family are loving it there in Munster because he loves that community. It's an extension of where he's grown up in Australia.
Sounds good. Well, listen, George, we've enjoyed watching the career from afar. I guess Keith has seen it up close and personal. Thanks so much for coming on. Stay safe over the next few months. These are strange times, and thanks again for making time for us this evening.